While you do that, do you mind if I record?
Go right ahead.
Thank you. Oh, you're on.
So, environmental justice as a movement, we usually date back to 1982. But one of the ways we think about environment and the environmental justice is to really emphasize that this is different from the traditional wilderness-focused environmental movement, in that the emphasis is on the environments in which human beings live. And so environmental justice has really given us the concept that the environment is where we live, where we work, where we play, where we go to school, and some people will also add where we pray. The spaces in which we spend our time and how those affect our health. And so this movement actually has really intersected well with the climate movement, in that so much of climate change is about what's happening to human beings, not just what's happening to polar bears. So just to provide a little background that helps to explain some of the key concepts of environmental justice. Back in 1982, there was an incident in which PCB waste had been dumped along the roadsides in North Carolina. And so that contaminated soil was gathered up and they needed a place to dispose of it. And the state decided that they would create a new toxic waste landfill in Warren County. Now, the citizens who lived in Warren County were not happy with this choice. And they felt they were being targeted because it wasn't as if they had produced this waste and yet it was going to be dumped on them. And they also thought that perhaps the reason they were being targeted was because this county was quite poor. It was one of the 4 poorest counties in the state, and it was also one with the highest percentage of minority residents. So the majority population in Warren County was Black. And the area where they wished to place the PCB waste was right next to an African-American community. And people were deeply concerned that this was going to contaminate their groundwater and that they were going to be subject to diseases like cancer. Now, in the process of creating this landfill site, they had to present a proposal and it had to meet certain EPA requirements, but it didn't. And so the state was actually asking for waivers on basic EPA requirements about what constitutes a proper landfill. So if you're going to build a landfill, you have to be a certain distance above the groundwater table. This was not. It was only about 10 feet above the groundwater table. If you're going to build a landfill, the soil chemistry matters because you need soil that will be impermeable, that moisture will not seep through and carry the chemicals from the landfill down into the water table. And this soil did not meet those requirements. And yet the waivers were granted and the landfill was built. Now, it didn't go in easily. The people protested. They took the playbook of the civil rights movement and they went out and they got media attention. They marched in the streets. People, when the dump trucks started coming to bring that waste into their community, they went out. First, they went to the Baptist church. They all prayed together. And then they went out and laid down in the street to stop those dump trucks from arriving at this new landfill next to their community. Over 500 people were arrested. They failed, and because they were right about how inappropriate this site was, 20 years later, the EPA had to spend millions of dollars to dig all that waste up and move it somewhere else because this was not a good location for it. The area had filled with water. The cover on the site was making little bubbling noises, and the groundwater was endangered. The positive thing that came out of this was research that went to examine, why did this landfill end up there? Was it just a one-time occurrence, or was this actually a pattern in our nation? So the United Church of Christ actually funded a research study through its Commission for Racial Justice back in 1987. And they looked at the location of all of the toxic waste sites in the United States. And what they discovered was the single best predictor of where a toxic waste site would be located in the United States was the race of the people closest to that area. These sites were being located near minority communities. The second strongest predictor was income. These sites were being located near impoverished communities. We even actually have a smoking gun on this that demonstrates this wasn't accidental. The waste site companies in California had actually at one point worked with the government of California to talk about where were the best locations for toxic waste facilities or locating waste dumps in general. And they had created a list of things that would make it easier to persuade a community that there should be a site there, or even to bypass the community entirely. And that list included things like low income, rural, non-English speaking, Catholic, which of course is code for Hispanic in California. So we could see that the siting of toxic waste was actually being targeted to people who are the least likely to have the political power to challenge that process. The field of environmental justice expanded out from that awareness about the siting of toxic waste to look at other environmental issues that affect people, and discovered that manufacturing facilities that produce pollution, whether petroleum facilities or chemical plants, also tend to be located close to minority, low-income communities. They discovered that the legacy of redlining, which determined that some communities would have neighborhoods where there was disinvestment and the housing quality would drop, that created areas that then were targeted for zoning regulations that were more likely to put manufacturing and polluting facilities near them. If you think about Kalamazoo, it's not an accident that the US Highway 131 business loop runs straight up the north side. It runs straight up the old redlined neighborhood in Kalamazoo. That doesn't happen accidentally. These are patterns. And there's this recognition that the intention of our regulatory structures may not be racist, but the outcomes frequently are. So that means there are systemic problems that need to be addressed. So coming out of this, there's some key concepts. Most of us are familiar with the idea of distributed justice. Most of us probably, when we think about environmental justice, we think about who's closest to the pollution. So we have this unequal distribution of environmental burdens, the things that cause health problems, the things that create unpleasant environments. We also have unequal distribution of environmental benefits, like where are the parks? Who gets the nicest neighborhoods, the sidewalks, the schools that look really good? But what this process, what this research has also demonstrated is that there's an issue of procedural justice. How those things ended up where they are, that occurs because of the processes through which we make decisions about how we're going to zone different areas, where we're going to say it's okay to put those polluting facilities, how strictly we're going to regulate what comes out of the smokestack, or where the effluent coming out of a pipe goes, how much of it has to be cleaned up before it ends up in a particular area. So along with the issue of distribution, that it is unfair that some people are more exposed to environmental pollution, there's this concept of procedure that argues that the people most affected by the decisions about the environment should have a meaningful role in making those decisions. And as we saw in Warren County, consistently that doesn't happen. Along with this is this concept of recognition justice. Who is given respect? Who is valued? Whose voice is listened to? So when you look at processes for making a decision, like where a highway goes, where you're going to site a facility, whether or not the graphics packaging plant should be expanded on the north side of Kalamazoo, and you have a process that is on its surface fair. It says we're going to have a public comment period and everyone can come and they can make comments about what's going on. Whose comments are more valued? Do we listen to an engineer differently than we listen to a person who lives in the neighborhood? Do we listen to a person who can speak with a lot of technical language differently than we listen to a person who maybe doesn't have as high of an educational background? So recognition justice is a factor, and then creating processes so that people can have meaningful participation. Many of our siting processes currently starts out with the corporation and the government agency, and they're in a dialogue about what are the regulations that have to be met. And then after they've created a whole proposal and the city is pretty much already signed on, then there's a public comment period and the public gets to come and make comments after the fact. They didn't get to help create the proposal. They didn't get to have a voice in deciding what would work or not work ahead of time if that thing's going to be near their community. So it is possible to create processes that work better. And we're making progress on this. But those are key ideas that we need to carry forward when we're thinking about climate justice. Who's helping to make the decisions about how we respond to climate change? Because some of those decisions look really different when you're the person in the community than they look if you're taking a macroeconomic or an engineering perspective. This is an example I like to use in my class. The town of Kivalina, Alaska. This is an indigenous settlement. A people who used to migrate continually created a permanent settlement when the government basically said you have to have a school. So because of government regulations in the middle of the 20th century, this community created a permanent town, and this spit of land used to be much bigger. So what has happened is that with climate change, there has been a reduction in sea ice. It used to be that by the time winter storms arrived, there would be miles of ice on the left side of this picture, protecting this community from those storms coming in off the ocean. But now the ice develops so late in the season that winter storms arrive before that protective ice barrier has formed. And so this peninsula has eroded until there's just this tiny bit of it left. You can see that the Army Corps of Engineers has gone in and done some boulder scaping along the edges to try to protect it until a permanent solution can be found. Now, the government is taking responsibility for this, not really on the grounds that the government's responsible for climate change, which one could argue, but on the grounds that they have an obligation to look after this indigenous community. And so the Army Corps of Engineers is tasked with the job of relocating this town. So they've gone across the lagoon on the right side of the screen, and they've looked at sites where they could relocate the community. And they've essentially assessed 4 different sites and ranked them. And from an engineering perspective, one is clearly superior because the subsurface will be much easier to stabilize. So it's much easier to build a safe community on that area. But from the perspective of the Inuit community members, that is not a good site because it's much too far from the water. And their culture is based on access to the water so that they can go fishing and hunting and have easy access to the sea ice in the wintertime. So there's a different one of the 4 options that they like much better because it gives them greater proximity to the water. But from an engineering perspective, it will be harder to make that site work. So we see this dialogue going on between engineers and the community who have very different concepts of what is important when this community gets relocated. I will say this is a decent process in that the community voices are being included throughout the process and they will probably get their way. It's just going to cost us more as taxpayers to make it just. Another issue where we see the community members, because of their personal experiencing, having a very different perspective, has to do with carbon taxes as a solution to climate change. California established a cap and trade system back in 2006. The communities, the EJ communities, environmental justice communities, were concerned at the time. They worried that as an outcome of this, that polluting facilities would actually remain in place longer because they would be able to essentially pay for the right to pollute, and it would take longer to get rid of them than it would have if there were regulations that simply said you can't put this pollution in the atmosphere. And there's some studies now that suggest that that actually is true. So when this cap and trade system came up for a vote to determine whether it would continue, this was last year, the environmental justice communities actually lobbied against that proposal. They were out there saying, we don't think this is a good plan because it looks really different if you're a fence line community, literally only a fence separating you from the source of the pollution than it looks from a macroeconomic perspective or from a sort of 10,000 foot view where you're just thinking about how to use market forces to affect climate change. These communities feel that they're being treated as sacrifice zones. They're being left to suffer so that other people can do things in a way that's politically expedient. We also see the communities have a very different perspective on carbon offsets. So the idea of a carbon offset is it generates a credit which is sold to the polluter. You've probably had this experience where you go to book an airplane, right? And it asks you, do you want to purchase carbon offsets? So the amount of carbon that you're responsible for due to flying on this aircraft will somehow get sequestered somewhere else on the planet by somebody else's actions. Now, some of those offset programs are probably pretty good because they involve planting new trees, which means you're actually adding capacity to sequester carbon. But a lot of them actually are about protecting forests that already exist. And there's a real concern that these offsets are actually a new form of colonialism, a new form of taking away from the communities who live with those resources. So one of the ways we see this play out is in relation to efforts to prevent deforestation. The standard process for this was developed by the United Nations, the so-called RED program for reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. And the theory was that the forest provides an ecosystem service. In this case, it sequesters carbon. It sequesters the carbon in the trees that pull the carbon out of the atmosphere. It sequesters carbon in the soil. And if those forests, as we know, if those forests get cut down, we are all in really big trouble. The tropical forests are often described as the lungs of the planet, and those of us in the global north who've already cut down our forests would really like it if the global south would not follow in our footsteps. So the theory was simple and seemed logical, right? Wealthy northern countries would recompense the developing world for protecting its forests because the pressure to cut the forests is economic. Big spaces in the forest, like you see in this image, get cleared in order to create cropland or to create grazing land so that people can raise crops or beef for export to the global economic market. And it's all about joining the industrial international economy. So if we could offset that economic argument, then it seemed like this would help protect the forest. And in theory, it's beautiful. But if you don't have a procedural justice process, when you're doing this, then you end up causing more injustices. An example, in Ecuador, the Sapara tribal lands are one of the areas of high biodiversity. Throughout the planet, if you look today at where are the areas where we really have healthy ecosystems and biodiverse systems, you will see that almost always they're on indigenous lands. Some of them, because of my research, I noticed, are also sacred forests. So there can be a religious component as well. So in this case, you have 990,000 acre area that the government acknowledges as the territory of this particular community. And the government has identified 6 potential oil concessions on that land that it would very much like to profit from. So this tribe is fighting to protect the forest. To this tribe, the forest is actually an entity. They describe it as Naku, as a being who protects them. And the forest is a place not only for sustainable hunting, but also a place for medicinal plants that are used in traditional medicines. And so they are deeply invested in protecting the forest from development. But their own government has become one of the forces that they're fighting against, because the government wants to sell carbon offsets for protecting that forest. It isn't the tribe that's being consulted about this. It's a government agency that's doing this. And sometimes they'll look for a tribal representative who can sign off on it. But for some reason, government agencies always seem to find some tribal representative who's not actually from the local tribe, but a new resident in the area who's maybe running a local business, and therefore is really visible. So what happens if the government does set up a carbon offset system is that an organization, a corporation that needs an offset, or the state of California or the nation of Norway will go in and give money. And maybe the government says, you know, we're going to spend some of that on the community, but most of it somehow never gets there. But in the meantime, the government will go in and say, well, this is now a forest preserve, and so no one can collect medicinal plants, no one can collect firewood, and no one can cut down any trees, even if the traditional tree uses were sustainable, because for a tribe like this, it usually meant maybe cutting 1 or 2 trees a year to make a canoe or build a house, and it in no way harmed the viability of the forest ecosystem. So suddenly we have a taking of the forest in the name of protecting the climate that is like another step of colonialism, taking the rights away from the indigenous communities. So there's a very strong movement to strengthen indigenous rights to community, to acknowledge that those high biodiversity spots, those places where the forest ecosystems are actually healthy, may be healthy because they are tribal territories as opposed to being areas being developed by colonial powers. And so to strengthen those rights to territory, and not to say, okay, we're going to use your territory, but say you have the right to determine what happens in this land where you have lived for thousands of years and done so in a sustainable way. That means there are people on the ground to protect the communities from fossil fuel development. There are people on the ground who want to protect that forest from corporations that sneak in and try to burn down sections and create areas for agriculture, for export. So those eyes on the ground are vitally important. Moving closer to home, we also see the environmental justice community working very hard on climate justice right here in the United States. Many of you, because we live here on the west side of the state, we're not necessarily aware of what's going on with DTE Energy on the east side. DTE Energy put together its annual integrated, so every 5 years or so, DTE has to come up with its 15-year integrated resource plan. This is a state requirement, and it goes to the Michigan committee that oversees how our utilities are developing their energy and handling energy. And in their most recent proposal, DTE basically said they were going to put in like 500 megawatts of solar versus, you know, consumers is doing 5,000, which still isn't enough, but hey, it's an order of 10 bigger. So then they also said they were going to take out a coal plant and replace it with a really big natural gas plant. The environmental justice community of Southeast Michigan decided they were going to take this on. They were going to fight against DTE's 15-year plan and use the planning process by which this would be presented for public comment to go in and fight for climate justice. Because they don't want another gas plant adding pollution, just, you know, get rid of the coal plant, now we'll have gas plants polluting us. They want renewable energy. They want clean energy. They're a fence line community and they're tired of having pollution. And they also want affordable energy, and they are very well aware that the cost of solar and the cost of wind are now lower than the cost of fossil fuels. They have been fighting against unaffordable energy for years. So we see this community rallying, and if you look at their literature, they talk about the concept of energy democracy, which brings up that concept of justice again. That those who consume energy must be active participants in decision-making process about how energy is produced and where it comes from. That it shouldn't just be the company that decides that. The people have to have a voice in the process. They're also incensed with the change in net metering here in Michigan, because solar panels were just getting to the point where they were affordable for low and moderate income people, and suddenly DTE and Consumers Energy are changing the payment structure so that it makes it harder for people to afford those solar panels again. These are communities that are really, they really like the idea of self-determination, and they have had a long and painful relationship with DTE, and they would actually love to get off grid. But at least they really would like to see community solar. So they want solar to be more accessible. They're fighting against the gas plant. And if you look at it, they will say straight up, this is about climate change and it's about air pollution, because they know that climate change is hitting them the hardest. Last year, maybe it was 2 years ago, there were 2 months in the middle of summer when the power kept going out in Detroit. And it was during a real hot spell, which was why there was stress on the grid. But this community sees that as a climate justice issue. They know climate change is making the summers even hotter, and they can't even get steady energy to provide air conditioning. So they want solar power in order to provide for steady, accessible power during the summertime. And there is this awareness that DTE is like a Goliath out there, right? It's this 100-pound gorilla that they're fighting. But when you're fighting for health, affordability, and democracy in your own community, it's worth trying to do that. So there's this strong, strong organizational movement. There's also a movement toward an actual partnership between the environmental justice community and the big green organizations. There's a wonderful website for an equitable and just climate future. You can see the link down there, justclimate.org, where they're really actually making some headway in getting the big green organizations that have the lobbying abilities and the financial resources to take seriously the necessity to include justice in our planning for how we deal with climate change. And so we see this playing out in the Green New Deal with the idea that dealing with climate change isn't just about the planetary climate, it's also about jobs. It's also about recognizing that some communities have been harmed by our fossil fuel industry exponentially more than others, and therefore making some of the resources for this transition available to those communities, whether that means training people in jobs related to the new renewable energy job options, like putting in solar panels or putting in wind turbines or managing those plants, or whether it means ensuring that these communities are cleaned up first instead of last. There's this strong emphasis on making that part of the process, not following the traditional model, which has been, well, first we have to solve the problem, then we can deal with justice. Instead, make justice part of the solution to the problem. Tom Goldtooth, who has been the executive director of the Indigenous Environmental Network since the 1980s, has made the statement repeatedly that a transition away from the use of fossil fuels is inevitable, but justice is not inevitable in that process. And what we see the environmental justice community saying is, we're not going to wait for someone else to fix it for us. We need to be in the room, developing these processes, making decisions about how we're going to address climate change from the very beginning. And there's a lot of excitement right now about the Biden administration, which does seem to be making a real effort to bring these communities in. There's one other really good example developing with the environmental planning in New York State. Has also, they're trying to develop a statewide climate plan, and they've brought in the environmental justice communities as part of that discussion about how to do that from the very beginning. So we're seeing this intersection between these movements finally, and a real recognition that justice has to be part of the way we address climate change. So that gives you a background in these concepts. And what I really wanted to stress here is most of us are aware of the distribution. We know about the small island nations being flooded. We know about the hurricanes. Maybe we're aware of, I mean, there's this whole new field looking at disaster recovery and how low-income communities are the slowest to recover and may never recover from disasters because of the way the systems are set up in terms of insurance and who has access to FEMA and how to get that aid. Most of us are aware of the distribution issues, but it's the process, thinking about how to bring people in, give them ownership of the process, and how that may change where we put our emphasis in deciding which projects to do first or where to place some of our resources that I really wanted to emphasize today.
Wow, let's give Dr. Cybelle Shattuck, thank you so much. Let's everybody give her a big hand. Oh my goodness. So to make it clean, I'm gonna stop the recording now because I'm gonna share this with our class too. So your job is done for whatever week you're assigned to. So I'm gonna stop the recording and then we can open it up for questions and comment.